It's wonderful to talk with you about the Kindertotenlieder, which is translated Songs on the Death of Children. And it's a title from a book, actually. Lieder was an interchangeable concept for poem or song. And the poems actually come from, of course, Friedrich Rückert, who had two children die, I believe in 1838, within a very close, sort of over December, January. And Rückert, one of the most profoundly intelligent and learned men of his time, and effusive in his writings, sequestered himself and wrote endlessly for about 5 or 6 months in grief poems about these two children who had died. Now, children's death in the 19th century, as tragic as it always is, was a fact of life. Before penicillin, in the beginning of the 20th century, children simply died. Very often large families were because they were lucky and their children didn't die. People procreated in the hope that if you had 11, you might have 5 live. You know, I don't want to be terribly cruel about this, but the phenomenon of dying children, crib death, was not as startling then as it was. It made it no less sad or tragic, but this is out of this tragic grief and this grieving process. Rückert, in a very short amount of time, wrote around 425, 427 poems. He never published them in his lifetime. He died in 1861, which is a year after Mahler was born, and they were published in two editions. They were first published, the set of poems, by Rückert's daughter and by her son, and by his son. And in no competition, just two different versions, two different arrangements of the inner life of the cycles within the cycles of these songs. And some of the poems are extremely maudlin. They're not even particularly good poetry. They're all extraordinarily personal. This came to then Mahler much later. If you ask me how Mahler selected these poems, I'm not sure we can know that. But what we can know, and what we do know, and what is an astounding fact that I think is very important for people, is that out of these 427 poems, in unrelated position in both volumes, either from the son or the father, or the son or the daughter, Mahler chose these 5 poems. He didn't choose 12 and then settle down on 5. He chose these 5 poems. What is also quite interesting is when he wrote the first 3 of this cycle in 1901, we have no evidence that he was actually planning on a cycle. But and we don't have these other 2 poems lurking about. And it was sometime later that he actually separated the folder of Rückert poems from his Rückert songs, as we know them, versus what became Kindertotenlieder. The Kindertotenlieder were then finished in 1904. This is an extremely important fact. This man had spent to have written these 7 songs, the 4 Rückert songs that we know as the Rückert songs, and 3 of the 5 Kindertotenlieder in 1901, he would have had to have been familiar with books totaling around 600 to 700 poems of Rückert. This is an astounding thing. How well read Mahler was is something we don't discuss so much. The most important part of this process, however, is that Mahler in 1901 himself, in February, March, had a total health crisis, almost bled to death, and was very much congratulated by the doctor who operated on him and said, "You're lucky to be alive. I'm glad you lived through it. Any shorter time before you came to me or I got to you, this wouldn't have happened." He was very impressed with this, and he shared this story in some kind of detail with Natalie Bauer-Lechner. He talked about it often. And I think that, you know, we see in literature very often this phrase, yes, Mahler had a brush with death in 1901. I personally don't know anything that brushed Mahler. I think it was either part of his life and his consciousness, or it was not part of his life or consciousness. There was no sort of gratuitous, oh, well done, I'm sure glad we could save your life. No, this was a precipitous occasion which changed his career, it changed his schedule, it changed his attitude towards life, it changed his attitude towards marriage, progeny. It reflected upon his recently dead mother and recently dead father, the fact that he lost 8 siblings in his family. This cascade of internalization of mortality came upon him in a way that is unique and farther on than what we know even in his external manifestations of that phenomenon in his early works before 1901. This is how we come to Rückert and the Kindertotenlieder. I feel very strongly that what the Kindertotenlieder are not about, it is not a eulogy of dead children. The tragedy, the overwhelming, horrifying realizations that a child has died by no fault of its own, by the perverseness and harshness of nature, which is in and of itself life, is overwhelming. Mahler, I think, takes that rather self-understood. What Mahler's 5 poems about are, what do you do with your grief, and what do you believe are you releasing from life into death? In German we have diesseits, this reality, and we have jenseits, the other reality. Mahler is gathering a momentum in his philosophical life now in 1901, which becomes extremely developed by the time his short life is over, about, we say transcendence. Yes, transcendence is fine, but it's more linked to the early natural philosophers, both Goethe and a man named Gustav Fechner, whose assistant, Gustav Fechner's assistant, was one of Mahler's closest friends, Siegfried Lippener. And what they believed was that not only was there a transcendence, a pathway between death and life, but that in fact you became something else. This life energy is unsterblich. There is an immortality in the things we call, in the energy and the existence we call life. And this releases into sound and harmony and lights and vibrations. It's part of the of life that is with it. It's very, well, I suppose it's rather Eastern in this thought, but it is certainly, whatever it is an unknowable path that all of us will take. But the idea that either your life is finished or that there's retribution, this became more and more foreign. Mahler, by the time that he left us, tragically early, I think had found a kind of mysticism of his own. I hold Mahler as a culmination of different mysticisms, and I think that word applies for him much more. And this mysticism, this mystery of life, preoccupied him all of his life. And this death question was more about the infusion of belief and energy and respect and love of life in the here and now than ever to be confused as some kind of Todessehnsucht. Mahler did not want to die. Mahler was killed by nature. I suppose in some ways I have to release people to think how they want of it. All I can do is give you the facts. When he wrote the first three, or even conceived of a cycle, he was neither a father nor had even met his wife. Didn't even know the name Alma Schindler. The idea that he was preoccupied with what would be his own tragic fate in any way seems to me terribly foreign. That he was so bound up in the consciousness of children that die, and the perversity of nature that allows this to happen in his own family, losing 8 of his own siblings, or friends around him. I mean, there's a story about a man in the orchestra who Mahler's conducting, and he hears of him losing a child to sickness, and he's deeply moved, and he goes. And this is like 1903, 1904, and he speaks to him and says, you know, I have some poems that I've written on this. I can't imagine the grief, the pain you would go through, you know. And this is where then the famous quote comes. You know, if I had this experience, I'm sure I couldn't have written these songs. So I think we need to be very, very careful about what we project. I don't think we need to be any more maudlin or horrified at the death of children than is already in the fact of where these sources come from. The other thing that I would offer is that we get quite easy today talking about German Romanticism and natural symbols. And we project our emotions into nature, and the bird does this, and the stars do that, and the sun, and we even read sometimes the symbols in their iconography. And that's all fine and well and good as a personal expression, and I love it as much as anybody. But we should never forget that nature doesn't care. Nature is ambivalent. And this is caught up with a very German mentality, which is embraced in the word Wehmut. Weh, pain, and Mut, courage. Wehmut, to have Wehmut is to have courage in your pain. It's smiling through the tears. And when Mahler so often writes in his music, in some of the most unbelievably, unbearably melodic, sentimental kinds of ways, he writes in big handwriting, nicht sentimental. This is fate. In the Kindertotenlieder, whenever the horn plays, this is the ambivalence of life that we as human beings must understand and must accept. It isn't all about us. It's us all about it.